Then I was given a measuring stick, and I was told, "Go and measure the temple of God and the altar, and count the number of worshippers. But do not measure the outer courtyard, for it has been turned over to the nations. They will trample the holy city for 42 months. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will be clothed in burlap, and will prophesy during those 1,260 days." Before we look at the identity of the 2 witnesses, there are some important pieces of information from this passage to consider. Firstly, you'll notice that the Bible expresses the time of Jacob's trouble in many different ways. In this passage it says that they will trample the holy city for 42 months, and then in the next sentence is expressed as 1,260 days. It all refers to the same time period. 3.5 years is 42 months, which is 1,260 days. There's a fourth way, which is found in Daniel. "Then I, Daniel, looked and saw 2 other angels standing on opposite banks of the river. One of them asked the man dressed in linen, who is now standing above the river, 'How long will it be until these shocking events are over?' The man dressed in linen, who is now standing above the river, raised both his hands toward heaven, and took a solemn oath by the one who lives forever, saying, 'It will go on for a time, times, and half a time. When the shattering of the holy people has finally come to an end, all these things will have happened.'" A time is 1 year, times is 2 years, and half a time is half a year. So a time, times, and half a time equals 3.5 years, which is 42 months, or 1,260 days. It's always the same time period. Whenever you see these numbers, it's always referring to Jacob's trouble. Secondly, notice that John is given a measuring stick and told to go and measure the temple of God. This is significant because it means the temple of God will exist in Jerusalem during the 6th trumpet. Why is this significant? Because right now the temple does not exist. Indeed, there hasn't been a temple in Jerusalem since the last one was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. Where the temple used to stand on Temple Mount, Mount Moriah, there is now only the Islamic Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock Shrine. So obviously at some point in the future, prior to the 6th trumpet, that mosque is going to be torn down and a temple built in its place. What kind of political situation is going to have to occur before the Al-Aqsa Mosque is destroyed and replaced with a Jewish temple? Perhaps the kind of situation where an Antichrist pretends to be on the side of Israel by offering them, as a token of peace, the opportunity to retake control of Temple Mount so that they can rebuild their temple, only to turn on them once it has been completed so that he can use it as an idolatrous throne for himself. We don't know exactly. It's one of those events that doesn't seem to be in view right now, but could easily come into view at any time. It could happen tomorrow. We just know that there will be a temple there by the 6th trumpet. However it happens, when it happens, it will be the 3rd temple to occupy the site. The first temple was built by King Solomon, and it was destroyed in 586 BC when Israel was invaded and taken into slavery in Babylon. The second temple was built when the Israelites returned from that captivity, having been let go by King Artaxerxes. That was the one that Gabriel told Daniel about, the one whose destruction was predicted by Jesus at the beginning of the Olivet Discourse, and the one that actually was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. The third temple will be constructed according to the detailed measurements prophesied in Ezekiel chapters 40 to 44. No temple has yet been built according to Ezekiel's design in those chapters, so it must be a reference to the third one, which will occupy Temple Mount in the end times. We won't go into the specifications here, but I recommend that you turn to Ezekiel 40 to 44 now and examine the measurements. Is there any evidence that this temple could be built in the near future? Absolutely. In fact, the importance of a third temple to the Jews, particularly Orthodox Jews, can't be understated. They believe the building of the third temple to be absolutely vital for the coming of their Messiah. They didn't recognize him the first time, of course, and are therefore driven to make sure that they gain control of Temple Mount again to herald his arrival. In their eyes, the building of a third temple wouldn't just anticipate his coming, it would speed it up. So the third temple is not and will not be driven by Christians. Christians understand that Christ obsoleted the need for a physical temple. Rather, the whole endeavour is and will continue to be driven by the Jews. especially Orthodox Jews, who want to have the temple in its place so that they can reinstate daily sacrifices. Again, Christians know that the Mosaic law that required daily sacrifices has been abrogated by the New Covenant, but Orthodox Jews, believing the Mosaic law to still be applicable, would continue the practice of animal sacrifice to atone for sins if they had the temple in place. There is no question of them building a temple and reinstating sacrifices anywhere else either. They would not feel at liberty to move the Holy of Holies to any other location. It must be Temple Mount on Jerusalem. So strong is the desire to build a third temple there that most of the plans for its construction are already in place. Indeed, organizations like the Temple Institute and Temple Mount Faithful have not only produced the building plans according to Ezekiel's specifications, but they've also made the ritual objects and garments that would be used by the priests within. Some of these objects are on display in the Old City right now. The desperate hope of these organizations is that when conditions allow it to be built, everything will be ready ahead of time and the building process will be extremely quick. In fact, so advanced are these plans that it's estimated that the whole temple could be built in as little as 18 months. As I said, we don't know when the go-ahead will be given. It's one of those events that could happen any day now. But certainly it's plausible that the Antichrist could be the one to negotiate its construction at the outset of the initial 3.5-year period of peace. That would certainly gain the trust of the Jewish people and cause them to drop their guard. Either way, this is a key event that we should be watchful for. When we see control of Temple Mount transferring to the Jews, and when we see construction begin on a third temple, we'll know that another vital piece of the puzzle is falling into place. And now we can turn our attention to these two enigmatic individuals called the two witnesses. When Jacob's trouble begins, God will send these two into the midst of the carnage. They will preach the truth and announce the coming of the Lord. God says, "And I will give power to my two witnesses, and they will be clothed in burlap and will prophesy during those 1,260 days." I mentioned before in relation to the seven thunders that God always sends prophets ahead of time to warn the people of what he is about to do. I believe these two witnesses will therefore be the ones to reveal what the seven thunders had said. It's just too coincidental that there is still some hidden information to be revealed around the sixth trumpet, and then, right on cue, we read of two witnesses striding onto the scene to prophesy to Jerusalem. And not only will they prophesy, but they will have the power to back up their preaching with incredible miracles too. These two prophets are the two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of all the earth. If anyone tries to harm them, fire flashes from their mouths and consumes their enemies. This is how anyone who tries to harm them must die. They have the power to shut the sky so that no rain will fall for as long as they prophesy, and they have the power to turn the rivers and oceans into blood, and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they wish. The two witnesses, although based in Jerusalem, the epicenter of the turmoil, will be spared any harm for the full 1,260 days. Indeed, anyone who tries to harm them will die. I was asked by a friend recently whether I believed that fire would literally shoot out of their mouths and consume their enemies. I have to say I don't know whether this is a literal description or not. Using the keep it simple approach, which I promised to use at the start of this series, that's what the Bible appears to suggest here. However, I understand the hesitancy. It just seems so unlikely. Perhaps they will just be able to kill attackers with a spoken word from their mouths, and the fire is a metaphor for this effect. However, I don't want lack of faith to be a barrier to our understanding here. So all I will say is that I believe that God could easily give those powers to his two prophets if he wanted. Whatever decision you come to, the most important thing here is that these two witnesses will be untouchable as they live under divine protection. Now the big question is, who are they? Who are these two defiant men strolling around the great city proclaiming the word of God during its darkest hour? Some believe they are Moses and Elijah because, like these two prophets, Moses was known to turn rivers and oceans to blood and struck Egypt with many kinds of plagues, while Elijah was known to destroy people with fire and to stop the rain. In other words, the signs that Moses and Elijah carried out in days gone by match up exactly with those described here. Furthermore, Moses and Elijah significantly appeared beside Jesus at the Transfiguration. Others claim that these two witnesses are Enoch and Elijah. The main force of this argument lies in the fact that these are the only two people in history never to have tasted death. Since Hebrews 9:27 says, each person is destined to die once and after that comes judgment, there's an argument that they will both have to come back to experience death once before judgment. I think, however, that this is the weakest theory. A third group of people claim, and I'm one of them, that since Moses, Elijah and Enoch were just ordinary people, it was the power of God that was extraordinary in their lives. God is more than capable of displaying the same power through ordinary people in the end times as well. As such, there is no reason at all why these two prophets need to be famous reincarnations. They could just be a type of prophet that has gone before, in the same way that John the Baptist was a type of Elijah. Indeed, remember at the Transfiguration, the disciples asked Jesus when Elijah was going to show up in the flesh, and Jesus said, Elijah has already come, but he wasn't recognized. Then the disciples realized he was talking about John the Baptist. We perhaps should not make the same mistake as the disciples and expect a literal reappearance from Elijah, Moses, or Enoch, but should rather understand that two will come along who will be like them. They will have the same kind of ministry. I personally believe that they will be a type of Moses and a type of Elijah, not only because the miracles they perform so clearly parallel those performed by Moses and Elijah, but because the end times will parallel the times in which those prophets lived. It will parallel the time of the Exodus when Moses was prominent, in the sense that God is visiting plagues on the land while passing over those who are sealed in blood. There will also be an exodus occurring as the 144,000 flee from Jerusalem to the wilderness, and we'll talk more about that later. It will also parallel the time of Elijah, in the sense that there will be so little faith in the land. In Elijah's time, there were only 7,000 that hadn't bowed the knee to Baal, and in the end times, there will be a similarly small proportion. Similar times will require similar men. Many people have noted that their description as two olive trees and the two lampstands that stand before the Lord of all the earth is very reminiscent of Zechariah 4, where two olive trees and one lampstand are identified as Joshua and Zerubbabel. But again, even if this connection is worth making, I wouldn't expect a literal reappearance from Joshua and Zerubbabel in the end times. The end times witnesses will just be a type of two prophets who have gone before. And again, I believe that whoever they are, they will be instantly recognizable when they arrive on the scene in the midst of this terrible time for Israel. Not only because they will be extremely visible, not only because they will come along during the time of Jacob's trouble, not only because they will be performing miracles, not only because they will be found in Jerusalem, and not only because they will be proclaiming the word of the Lord, but because they will be standing in defiance of the Antichrist. When they complete their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the bottomless pit will declare war against them, and he will conquer them and kill them, and their bodies will lie in the main street of Jerusalem, the city that is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, the city where their Lord was crucified. And for 3.5 days all peoples, tribes, languages and nations will stare at their bodies. No one will be allowed to bury them. All the people who belong to this world will gloat over them and give presents to each other to celebrate the death of the two prophets who had tormented them. At the end of the 42 months, the 1,260 days, the 3.5 years of Jacob's trouble, the beast that comes out of the bottomless pit will overcome these two witnesses and kill them. Now there was only one beast who came out of the bottomless pit who was named, and that was Abaddon, the destroyer. None of the other demons were named except him. Therefore, I think we can deduce that he is the one responsible for the deaths of the two witnesses. He will cut them down at God's set time. And we'll talk about how later on. In the meantime, note that Jerusalem is so generally overrun by evil men and in such moral decay that it could figuratively be called Sodom. Sodom is often held up as the benchmark of depravity in the Bible. Also note that the Israelites are so badly subjugated that it resembles the days of slavery in Egypt. Who would ever have thought of calling Jerusalem Sodom or Egypt, names that seem so antithetical to everything Jerusalem has traditionally stood for? It's quite a shocking statement to make, yet those comparisons are not accidental. Because the two witnesses have been speaking against the immorality and preaching the imminent return of the Lord for 3.5 years, this has tormented the consciences of the listeners, and instead of turning to God, they have instead hardened themselves. Proclamation of the truth tends to have that effect. It polarizes. There's evidence that some will turn to God at this time, but in general, the vast majority will go in the other direction and hate the two witnesses for the words that they speak. Therefore, when the two witnesses are finally killed, there will be a time of great rejoicing in Jerusalem. The people will stare and gloat over their bodies which lie in the street for a full 3.5 days. In fact, so happy will the non-believers be that they will celebrate the event with a public holiday. Amidst a carnival-type atmosphere, people will be exchanging gifts to commemorate the occasion. But after 3.5 days, God breathed life into them, and they stood up. Terror struck all who were staring at them. Then a loud voice from heaven called to the two prophets, "Come up here," and they rose to heaven in a cloud as their enemies watched. At the same time, there was a terrible earthquake that destroyed 1/10 of the city. 7,000 people died in that earthquake, and everyone else was terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. The second terror is past, but look, the third terror is coming quickly. So after 3.5 days of gloating and celebration, the two witnesses will be resurrected and ascend to heaven in full view of their enemies. At that time another earthquake will strike the city, causing much destruction and the deaths of 7,000 people. Those who don't die and who see the two witnesses being resurrected at the end of Jacob's trouble will turn to God for forgiveness. I will later refer to them as 11th hour converts, because this all happens at the end of the end.